Welcome to Decoding the Data Ecosystem, a podcast with valuable insights, inspiring stories, and practical advice to guide you on your journey through the world of omics research and how the NIH Common Fund data ecosystem can support that journey. I'm your host, Dr. Allissa Dillman, and I'm the Training and Engagement Director of the CFDE Training Center. My background's in bioinformatics, and I've been working in bioinformatics and data science training and engagement space for almost the past 15 years. I'm really passionate about lowering the barriers of entry for these fields through creative engagement activities such as these podcasts. Now let's get to the show. Today I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Noël Burtt. Noël is the Director of Operations and Development of the Diabetes Research and Knowledge Portals at Broad Institute. So hello, Noël, and welcome to our inaugural episode. We'd love to have you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role at the Common Fund Data Ecosystem, which from here on out, by the way, we will refer to as CFDE, so we don't have to keep saying that mouthful.
Beautiful. Thanks, Allissa. I'm so glad to be here, and I appreciate that you want to use acronyms because one of the things about CFDE that I love is the navigation of acronyms. Anyways, so I'm happy to be here again. My name is Noël Burtt. As Allissa mentioned, I'm from the Broad Institute. My background is in human genetics, but for the last 10 years, I've been involved in building scientific resources to make knowledge from biomedical data more useful to others. Started in the diabetes field, hence the background in diabetes genetics. And we started with a very simple knowledge portal in type 2 diabetes to make summary level statistics from association studies, from GWAS studies and sequencing studies accessible to the world. And that was something that was really kind of fun and exciting to do because really it's about the community of investigators that are generating the data and stewarding those results to other people. And so that's something that we're very excited to be part of as part of the Knowledge Center, which is our center within the Common Fund data ecosystem. We are meant to, sort of be a knowledge center component within the broader ecosystem. So we're going to talk about the ecosystem a little bit today. But my role is I'm the principal investigator along with two others, Kyle Galton and Jason Flanick, for the Knowledge Center, which is we've only been funded in the Common Fund data ecosystem for about a year. So we're really excited to be part of it. And I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about, the CFDE, its roots and what it's really good at and what we're hoping to achieve over the coming years.
Excellent. So actually, I wanted to back up a little bit and first ask you a little bit more about what exactly is a knowledge portal and how did you end up getting involved in that?
I got involved in that because from the diabetes genetics community, as I mentioned a little bit. So if you're familiar with human genetics, back in like the mid 2000s, there were these very large genome-wide association studies where people had these big cohorts of common disease, diabetes being one. People were generating sequence data at scale sequence and genotype data at scale because it was effective and cheap and technologies had matured. However, the ability to generate that data was siloed in places that could do the generating, right? So data generating centers. And we were very lucky at the Broad Institute to be the data generator for this big, large sequencing study for diabetes. But what was really important to that is all the samples were coming from people everywhere around the world, right? It was their precious samples that they had spent years generating all the phenotype data, extracting the DNA, but also treating the patients in many cases. So our job was to really create a community within the diabetes genetics world of both the contributors of the data, us as generators, and folks who want to analyze it. And important to do that was to create a centralized way to disseminate the results. Even as human geneticists, getting the data to each other was hard. So we built a very simple pipeline with Jason Flanick, who's a computer scientist who works very closely with me. We share a lab together. And we built a very small portal to make those results accessible just to ourselves within the community of geneticists. And that was really valuable, we thought, to geneticists, but it's even more valuable to folks who are, say, in industry or who are wet lab biologists who have their favorite gene that they want to study. They want to say, what does human genetics tell me about it? So for them, we decided to make a portal that really thinks about a user, not necessarily the data generator, and make it really easy for them to see results, summary level representations. And that's really the concept of knowledge portals came for us. Other people may be using it in different contexts, but we think about it as sort of the distillation of the results from the data. And we do that by two things, right? Really working closely with the contributors, the experts, the domain experts in the disease, the phenotype, the data type and whatnot, and the analysis mechanisms and methods. And then in developing a very flexible software platform that allows us to take the best practices of that community, encode them in software, and then make results accessible in a way that someone else can ingest and make useful. And so that's the sort of the genesis of knowledge portals. And so we got into it through that way. We expanded it beyond diabetes to some funding through NHGRI, to that for all common diseases. We've also dipped our toes in different areas, but one of the most exciting opportunities that we actually were lucky to stumble upon about a year and a half ago was the Common Fund Data Ecosystem. It was actually pretty awesome because I remember seeing the RFA and being like, oh man, this is a chance for us to like get uncomfortable and go beyond human genetics and do something with this very unique resource that is the Common Fund from NIH that, they've brought together an initiative across these 14 data coordinating centers. I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little more. And they want to have a center that helps bring results and knowledge across these DCCs to a broader user base. And we thought, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. We're a little daunted, but we were very lucky to be part of a great welcoming community. And, we have the opportunity to do it. So now we're here.
That's awesome. So speaking of community, I heard that you recently attended the American Society for Human Genetics conference in Colorado, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what were you all there for? What was the role of the Knowledge Center in that conference?
Well, first of all, I've been going to ASHG for, close to 20 years. But this was the first time I was able to go to ASHG and represent the Common Fund data ecosystem, and which was awesome. So we went there to have a workshop, like an ancillary session, which is during the conference, part of the conference sort of agenda. And it was an hour-and-a-half session where we brought together different members of the Common Fund data ecosystem to talk about what within the Common Data Fund ecosystem is useful to a human geneticist. So think about, that person sitting in the audience who studies a gene, studies a trait, uses human genetics to understand that. Why would they even use any of these data coordinating centers or the center, the data resource center, or any of the resources that the Common Fund data ecosystem has? Why would they use it? What's meaningful to them? And so our job was to sort of share that. It was the first time, I think, at ASHG that the Common Fund had been presented as an entity. So it was really fun to talk to other investigators who had never heard of it, or maybe heard of like one of the resources like GTEx, for example, right? So that was exciting. What was also cool is we did a booth. Booths are great if you're a pharmaceutical company, right? You're trying to generate money, but there's a great section of ASHG, which is all about nonprofit exhibitors, right? So it's a big group of those people. And so we did an exhibitor booth where we had stood up and we had a big screen where we had demos of the different centers within the Common Fund data ecosystem and then different data coordinating centers. And we had them visit. They were there giving demos, talking about their work, engaging with scientists. So it was like actually a really fun event. And I think it generated some really great ideas for us as an ecosystem as we go forward to really promote and expand the CFDE beyond its doors of its own ecosystem. And that's actually why we're so excited the training center is actually on board, because you guys are going to help us do that. So it's nice that we're talking today too.
Excellent. So you've talked a lot about sort of, you were at the booth, you had all these cool things you're showcasing for CFDE. But kind of on that note, so what do you think makes the CFDE a really unique and valuable resource for researchers across different scientific disciplines? Because you kind of mentioned already that, you're originally kind of in more of the human genetics world, but you wanted this to kind of be broader and expand out. So I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Sure. Well, what I think is exciting about the CFDE is I think most people have probably heard of the NIH Common Fund, right? It's an initiative of the NIH to fund transformative and catalytic resources. So there's some big ones, right? All of us, everyone knows all of us. That's an example. Or many people don't know that there's GTEx, which is funded by the Common Fund. GTEx, many people use. It's one of probably the most mature and widely used, right? If you're going to look up any genes relative expression, you go to GTEx. So that's really good for a human geneticist or someone studying a gene. But then as I started to, learn about the Common Fund, I learned all of these other data coordinating centers. So there's about 14 or so engaged data coordinating centers within the Common Fund data ecosystem, but they're all doing different things, right? You have ones that are trying to understand glycobiology. You have ones that are trying to understand, signaling in the body, electrophysical signaling, and developing an anatomical model of the path of a nerve through different, electrophysiology measures. You have people that are studying, exercise in rats. they're kind of like all over the map, but they have some commonalities, right? They all have data that they're generating that needs to be accessible to others. So that's why they have the Data Coordinating Center. They all have these really cool communities orbiting around them. And what's nice is even though they are in different sectors of biology, there's some themes, right? So they're generating molecular signatures, which is very useful if you're studying a process. They are generating reference maps to help you understand, the way cells are spatially oriented, HubMap, for example. That's useful in so many different contexts. If you're a person who wants to use some of these resources, it's a lot of work to go to every single one of them and figure out what you're going to learn, right? So I think the reason it's useful for biology is there are some commonalities across them. And I think they come from data. There's different types of data, like, many of the, like, I think at least 10 of the resources have large scale gene expression data. They are generating molecular signatures at scale. What's great about this is that I think any investigator who's studying a biological process or human disease could enrich their research by navigating through the data coordinating centers. But that's a lot of work. So you have the centers. You have the Data Resource Center and the Knowledge Center. So we're the Knowledge Center, and we have our collaborators who build the the Data Resource Center. And together, these folks focus on the data and the metadata and all the raw, like the resources of all the data coming from the data coordinator centers. We focus on the knowledge generated by those. And that sort of pairing is really cool because it makes sort of a one-stop shop for someone who wants to sort of understand what data are within the data ecosystem, what they can do with it, why it's valuable. And I think that's kind of a nice structure that the NIH has funded to help sort of bring people to the resource from different points of contact. So you can imagine if you are working in Kids First, which is another resource, right? Really focusing on rare disease in children, they have a lot of touch points with many other DCCs through being part of this ecosystem for many years, whether they've done some partnerships, there's some funded activities, or they've just started collaborating because they got to know each other through our annual meetings and talking to each other and just getting to know each other, or they've shared data with the DRC. DRC, Data Resource Center, has been amazing in generating tools to make those data more useful. So I guess there's all these different components of the ecosystem. It's an awesome term, ecosystem, because everybody has their own roles, but they're interdependent, which is really cool. And I think that's what makes the entire ecosystem useful to a biologist in a way that a single resource wouldn't, or it makes it easier for them because you sort of bring together all of them in this one sort of entity.
Yeah, I like that you really brought out the idea of like the ecosystem. I really like the term ecosystem as well because to me, like I really think of an ecosystem as like a living, breathing thing that's constantly in flux and trying to balance all of these different components. And actually, that kind of brings me to something I was just thinking about. You've talked a lot about this idea of connectivity. And it sounds like the Knowledge Center is really not just about like connectivity of data, but almost kind of connectivity of communities.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on how the Knowledge Center sort of does fit in that sphere of like connection of not just information, but of communities themselves and sort of how they move and think about their data and what they want shared and how they think it should be shared and things like that.
That's been really fun, to be honest. I think, part of the ecosystem, the goal is that every data coordinating center has to share their data with a central resource, the DRC. And they're busy. They're very busy centers. They have they're humming along with their consortia. But what we've learned, we when we first started the project, we were like thinking, how do we engage with everybody? How do we get to know them? And it was a little daunting. But you think about it, people love to talk, and humans do science. And so they're the generators of ideas. And so we went around to each DCC and just had conversations with them. And that was amazing. It was first like the welcoming, that's all great. But, and I didn't even anticipate how great that was. That was even better. And how open they were and how willing they were to collaborate and talk about their ideas or things they haven't been able to do. They were like, oh gosh, could you guys please do this? And that's really the spark for us. So as a Knowledge Center, we don't know necessarily when we're starting out, like what is the stuff we want to make accessible. the communities at each of these DCCs really is the, the spark for those things. So
Although no pun intended for the program spark.
I didn't even think about that. I like that. Yeah,
Sorry.
that's true. I love that name. They really got that one right. It's beautiful. It's like so many double meetings with what they're doing. And anyways, they were so welcoming, and that's where we got our ideas. The first one was like, when we meet with them, they would just list them things in some places where we have this data, we've always wanted to do this. And listening and taking that and saying, what if we did this? And that's been the substrate for much of the results you'll see in the Knowledge Center. It's not really like something that we came up all by ourselves, in a corner. It really was like, we were listening to them and we're like, oh, we could do this. And they're like, yes. So it was a lot of kind of bringing them into our world, like how we think, and having them say, well, if this was done for us, we would use it. So there's like, it made it an exchange, right? A challenge, like a thing that we cared about together. So that for us was how we built the community with them, because you started to have those ideas and we made them accessible to them. It's something they had never done. So they get some results they had never necessarily done. And now it's accessible to another group of people. I'll give an example in a minute. But what was cool about that is, now when you go back to them, it's like, it almost becomes a process, and we know each other. It's about creating comfort with each other. And I think that's been the most fun part of that. So that's one aspect of community. But what I think is really exciting is in many cases, so MotorPack's a great example. MotorPack has this whole consortia, right? They're studying the physical transducers of exercise. I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but physical activity. And, they have a whole consortium that's studying different diseases or conditions or treatments on mice, rats, or humans. And they're doing physical activity, tests on them to see how things change. But as a result of that, you have a lot of people studying disease, right? Because physical activity is really, centered to that. Well, in my other hat, as a human geneticist studying diabetes, there's a whole community of people who think about diabetes, right? And the genetics of that. And when we talk to MotorPack, you start to think, well, I know this person and I know this person, and these cool connections start happening. But the best part is when you make that data in a DCC accessible to a user that they themselves haven't worked with, and you bring them along for the ride. So in generating communities, I think the tipping point for the CFDE is to think about itself as, because all the DCCs have their own personalities and communities, the data ecosystem itself hasn't really been its own sort of community itself, right? It's community of communities. But as we're starting to have these centers be more, have more of like a web presence, a social presence, working together, bringing in ideas from the DCC's communities, you're starting to have that traction there. And so as a result, we can, as scientists who are part of the ecosystem, go out and promote the results that we're generating together as an ecosystem and engage with other, communities and disease areas. So for example, for our recent ASHG event, one of the things we did was, we want to enable discovery, right, at the end of the day. So, we think about, you could discover through a biological process, or you could, help someone who's studying a disease. And that's really our strength as human geneticists. So what we thought about was, in our other world where we do complex trait genetics, we thought, how can we bring that to the CFC? And one of the cool commodities, if you will, within the Common Fund data ecosystem is not only data, right? So data is well handled. Even before we joined the ecosystem, there's this really great, metadata model called C2M2 that all the DCCs have adopted to bring all their data together. That's published. They're working very consistently to make that accessible through the DRC. So that's really great. But the challenge with that is that it's a lot of it. You're constantly having to make them, update that. And, it's a little bit, it's unwieldy at times, but the DRC has done an incredible job of trying to do that. But then there's another part where you could think about what are the commodities or things that are being shared within the Common Fund data ecosystem that are across almost all the DCCs. And one is gene sets. So, in many cases, a DCC is perturbing something or, running a process. And an output of that is our list of genes that either change or respond or do something. And the great thing about genes is they're incredibly contentful in information, right? We know a lot about genes, right? And so those gene lists that are being produced by many of these DCCs are actually really useful, but they're useful to the DCC themselves. Like links is a great example. So they perturb a gene, and then they see what genes change, and they record that, and that becomes a gene list. And that's great, and that's on the links, and you can access that, and you can learn about all the provenance of that. But what if you could take that gene set and determine from human genetics what human phenotype is it linked to? And I guess that immediately changes links from something that, someone studies connectivity or mainly cancer, because that's kind of their orbit, to, oh gosh, all those gene sets could be useful for, I don't know, my favorite trait that has nothing to do with cancer, obesity or something, any other human trait. So the thing about the communities that matters there to me is it changes the CFD's and ethos to something that's useful for human disease, not just a lot of data. So it diversifies us and makes us more a sustainable entity and more vibrant. And so these have been the fun things that we've done at the Knowledge Center. So the outcome of that is that for all of these, I think there are 140,000 gene sets that have been generated by the Common Fund DCCs over time. And these are all curated, and the Data Resource Center has stored all of these. We took those and we applied a method that's within our human genetics. It's like a method that we have in our other knowledge portals that links us to genetics data through GWAS and sequencing studies, but created it's a mathematical model that gives you a score for how likely that gene set or the genes in that set are linked to a human phenotype. But moreover, what you can get is like those phenotypes, and then you also get the pathways. So through enrichment analysis, you get the pathways that are then constructed by those gene sets. So why is that useful? Well, you as a human disease researcher, if you access that, the path that you take then is you look at those genes and you're like, oh, I know about this gene, or I don't know about that one, right? Because that's information that you know, but also like, where did this come from? So you can wind yourself all the way back to that gene set and links, and you can learn about what contextualized that in terms of what was the perturbation, why did that matter, and see if there's a story to develop there. And what we're hoping to do, like this is the work, this is the hard part. So that's great, it's on a resource and everyone can play with it, right? And we have to educate them and make it useful to them. But what's great about that is if you find some really cool stories, at the end of the day, our hope is that someone from a disease community wants to work with links to follow up that or validate that. And that becomes a human, like a connection, a community that wasn't necessarily anticipated. Maybe that answers your question in sort of a broader sense, but that's really what I'm hoping. And our job as a Knowledge Center is to make those connections and think about these like cool ways by which this community can come in and this community can be leveraged better. So that's what we're hoping to achieve, not only by building this resource, but by, working with these investigators within the CFDE.
That's really awesome. I really love the very broad picture you just gave us. I did want to drill down a little bit and ask, in your experience at least, so you've talked about all of these different programs and all these different data centers and all these different tools and data, and they don't necessarily all perfectly connect all the time, but I was sort of curious to hear in your experience, what do you think are some of the sort of like baseline essential skills or knowledge areas that researchers should develop so they can kind of at least be prepared to dive into CFDE data effectively? Because there's so much, and I could imagine somebody getting very overwhelmed very quickly, although the Knowledge Center website linking everything certainly helps a lot.
But it's still overwhelming. You're totally right. I agree. And I imagine as an investigator, it does feel kind of like overwhelming, like where do I go for what, So I think I would say, based on who you are and how you like to navigate or use things, like if you are more computational, I think the Data Resource Center has made it incredibly straightforward for you to access the data and the metadata associated with all the Common Fund programs that are in the ecosystem. That's like well done. It's like in their data portal, you go there, you're like, I can see all the files, I can see their metadata, I can see where to go get them, who to contact if I don't understand them. That's super great. So I think if you have like like I want to download all of the metabolomics data from, metabolomics workbench. That's very straightforward to do. And you can either do that directly through metabolomics workbench, like go right to the source, or you can use the DRC as your, sort of like your coach to help you through that. So that's for data. And I think on top of that, the DRC has done a great job of creating a menu of tools by which you can compute or analyze, various common fund data sets. And they've done a good job of organizing that. But I think it's hard still because you got to know what you're looking for. So it's almost like you have to be directed to that. So I think the other way of thinking about it is you want to make it, in many cases, people want to go to the raw data. Let's just say you do, but you want to know kind of what you can know, right? And so if you wanted to, I think if you go to HubMap, you know what you're getting, right? HubMap has these beautiful, cellular maps, and you can type in different tissues and figure out, what the single cell mapping is and all the embeddings and get to all the data. And that's great if you really understand that space. However, I think the challenge is like, if you're like almost like a curious user, where you want to know what they have, that's a little bit difficult because there's so many things you could do. I think the resources are so mature. There's, there's menus and there's things. So I think our hope with the centers is to help to find ways to point people down the right path quickly so that they don't stumble and they're guided well. So through the Knowledge Center, we think about that by presenting summary representations, like the foundational knowledge from a DCC, the actual, what are they meant to do? What are they producing? What data types they have? Simple stuff. What is the primary knowledge? Like, what are the things from the flagship manuscripts or the papers? And like making those accessible in like summary figures. So you kind of know, like if you've seen a figure like that, you're like, that's, a differential expression plot. That means they have expression. Great. Now I know what kind of data I could get in there, for example. Then there's like the things that you don't know you can do, which are the blending of data from this DCC and that DC and DCC, and maybe another external, method or tool, or even an NIH resource. That's a little bit more complicated, and that's something we're hoping to do with the Knowledge Center. But I think to get back to your initial question, I think my hope is like, we almost, as the centers grow, we almost allow the user, once they enter, so the web-based version of the Common Fund Data Ecosystem, to tell us about you a little bit, and then tailor the experience a little bit to them. So for example, like we think about it as like contexts within the Knowledge Center. We think like if you're a computational biologist, we want to frame the representation of things to you on an online resource in a way that you would resonate with. Or if you're an experimentalist, we don't want you to get bogged down with all the, the models and the data. We want to just show you the summary plot and say, this is what you should learn from this. But if you are so intrepid, here's the steps by which you need to go. So I think the centers are going to really help to elevate the common data sets and the common elements and the common themes within the ecosystem and make those very clear to a user. I think if you're someone who's already using one of those resources, you won't really need our help as much, right? The data coordinating centers, they have their experts. But we're hoping, I think, in many cases, to bring some of the folks that routinely use, one particular DCC for their favorite thing, to make them aware in many cases that there's that same data type, perhaps, or other information on a phenotype that might be, central to that data coordinating center in the other parts of the ecosystem. So one of the things we're hoping to engage the DCCs in is sort of that, hey, you're here at the DCC, do you want more? Then go into the broader ecosystem. I think that's actually a really cool way for us to bring in communities and navigate people through learning what the ecosystem has to offer.
So just to kind of push that a little further, you talked about, users that maybe have their favorite already, and we want to kind of expand their view out a little bit. But what about people who don't really know much about, any of the kinds of data in the Common Fund ecosystem, but are related to their work? So maybe social scientists, behavioral health scientists, or folks who are more on the clinical side, but want to start to understand some of the molecular information that's out there. What might help them access this data, and where do you suggest they might start?
Well, I think they need some basic stuff, which is just like what's in here, like videos and tutorials. And, people like those because they can stop and start them and start their at leisure, which is nice. Or like when they're drinking coffee in the morning, they can just watch them. I think that's actually really important, especially given the complexity of this research, especially the types of researchers you mentioned. They're not the ones that like every day I think all these DCCs wake up to think about, right? Because they're thinking about their particular world, or, they're thinking about a very specific expert in XYZ field, right? So I think as centers, the centers that are now funded within the Common Fund Data Ecosystem, I think our job is to think about those types of people that you mentioned. So I think very simple training is really useful, important, and I think we need to do more of that as a community. I think a web presence that is just like, here's just a very like basic navigational world is important. So like you can not go to things that will confuse you. I think that's hard to do because you want to do more is more, but I think in many cases less is more for someone who's not familiar with the basic stuff, right? So I think that's a nice thing. But I'll tell you, to me, the one way to do it is literally talking to them and finding opportunities to bring them into, whether it's through workshops, online webinars, whether it's through conferences where a lot of folks in that space go to, and just listening, like, what do you want to learn? And then saying, like, actually responding to that and showing them and walking them through it. Because then I think what ends up happening, if you do that well, is, it starts to seep in with one or two investigators or groups, and they'll use it and they'll tell other people about it. I do think that it's really important in this space because you have to speak the language of that community. And that's something that, I'm sure you guys as a training student think about a lot. And I think that that's an exciting part of what the CFD needs to do better. And I think it'll be a fun challenge for us to work on over the coming years. Because, so many of these, the average bench scientist working in a lab in Nebraska probably doesn't know what the Common Fund is and all the data that they could mix. Maybe they may not, but what if they're studying a gene or they're studying a process, what if they could really quickly navigate through that center, to a center or to a place, better word, and find out, oh man, I could learn like all the expression that's like in the Common Fund Data Ecosystem for my favorite gene right away. That may be helpful, it'd be support for me. Oh, I didn't know that, through this gene, there's been some, I don't know, exercise like data generated from MotorPack. There's things that you wouldn't imagine would be useful, but could be discoverable if we position our presentation of the Common Fund Data Ecosystem in a very given way. So I think that's something that is a rising challenge for us across the ecosystem as centers and data coordinating centers.
It's certainly something that us at the training center are thinking pretty hard on right now, right? There's a lot of great in-depth technical tools and skills and knowledge, but really trying to think of how do we bring in, folks who didn't even know they could be new users is something that we're really trying to drill down on for sure.
Well, actually, you just touched upon something when you said, like, one of the things you said when we first met you at the, the face-to-face and back in October, when you guys were just onboarded as a training center, you were talking about things that I hadn't even thought about, just like these courses about almost crash courses in like simple bioinformatics. And maybe there's something there to that, like creating more opportunities for people to learn how to use these data, even though they might be in a social science setting. And I think that could be a really cool way. I know that sounds like maybe that's something that you already are thinking about, but I think that's a very similar, like, hey, you could learn how to use this and like know how to do something with this data, but then what data are there? I think that's like a nice, almost like an incentive where people may not have wanted to, like, I don't know, run a bioinformatic pipeline, but it could be useful for them in their research in a way they didn't anticipate.
That's actually exactly how we're thinking of it right now. And some of our first how-to videos will be sort of along the lines of like, hey, You probably remember RNA from a long time ago, but let's
Yeah.
refresh. And also, now that you're excited about this, here's some data sets that have those data types.
Precisely. Yes. So it's almost like they don't want to actually bother with it because it's a little nerve-wracking to think about it, but you're going to make it just a little easier for them and then expose them to all the data that they can use. I think that's really a cool idea. I think that'll be valuable.
Excellent.
Yeah. I think that'll be really valuable to do.
So we've talked a little bit about what CFDE is. We've talked a little bit about, the kinds of skills and tools and resources that are available. And I'm just kind of curious about how you're thinking about sort of the future now. Like, right, so where do you see CFDE evolving to meet the needs of our various and complex research communities?
I like that question because that's my favorite thing to think about. Particularly, well, I'll answer the questions in two ways, internally and externally. I think, even my son, I'll give my son as reference, he hears things like machine learning, AI, and things like that, like in his world, and like he's a freshman in high school. And you hear ChatGPT and all these technologies, and our children are being exposed to that. And even as a scientist, where we are using those things every day, hopefully in a good way, AI and things like that. There's so many buzzwords in the community. And then there's also this sort of plume of online resources, right? So the NIH has done an actually incredible job, right? Many of us are funded by this. This is how we do our work. So we're very, very grateful. Funded these amazing resources to build either like a data coordinating center with an online portal, place to access all the data, store it all, these cloud infrastructures, all of these incredibly cool workbenches in many cases, that you've heard of those in many cases, like the All of Us workbench. You've got all these large initiatives to make data accessible to the world. That's awesome, right? However, right, these are what happens in 10 years when funding priorities change and things like that. Or more importantly, because there's so many of them now, there's almost a bit of a siloing going on itself within the NIH funded activities and beyond NIH, so international consortia and things. So, but they all have the spirit of, we want to make this useful to others. So that's great. So like level set there, I think that's a good thing. They're all generating data at scale, like big data in whatever area, spatial omics, you got genetics really, humming along. You've got clinical, you understand what I'm saying. I think the CFD has a unique opportunity because it was one of them, the first of its kind. I want to say that. It may not be, but I think that we have an opportunity because of the way we're thinking. Because you have a lot of these DCCs, right? They're doing exactly what you're saying, generating a lot of data, making it accessible in their own way for their own community. They're kind of siloed. Our centers are responsible for breaking down that silo, bringing the data together, generating knowledge, training people about it, coordinating, creating cloud infrastructures for all the data to come together. That's a unique thing all by itself. So that sort of, it's like a mini expression of what I think NIH needs to do more broadly, which is make it so much easier for a researcher to access the data and the knowledge from all of these large scale NIH funded resources and initiative to ensure that they're more useful to others. So it's like we've made like that mini, if we do this successfully, we will serve almost as a paradigm or as, sort of the community leaders for other areas that could do this. So what I mean by that is like, what if you can imagine, each time we as a CFDE ecosystem incorporate data from another NIH resource, we're already kind of like creating that broader ecosystem. An ecosystem is inside of something, right? So there's broader ecosystems. That's what I think is the fun thing about CFD is if we can, as a community, create a sense of who we are, what we value. We value enabling discovery to folks studying human disease or processes, beyond our borders, if you will. But we do that through the expertise of all of these data coordinating centers and the communities that orbit around them. And we bring that to a broader community of researchers. That's an example that I can think NIH or any public-private partnerships or other, commercial entities might find valuable. And I think if we think about clever ways to make data accessible, like, connecting to different disease communities, or thinking about different sectors of biology or data science or clinical follow-up and clinical studies, clinical trials is an example. How we connect to those with the data we have and the expertise we have, I think creates a paradigm for how these large-scale resources remain vibrant and live beyond their funding stream or their initial mandate. So what I'm most excited about is CFD as a community kind of leading the charge there. I think that'll be a fun thing to be part of.
So I want to end with actually a little bit of a fun question. So my original research was also a lot around RNA biology and transcriptomics. So I often like to ask people, and I think this is especially pertinent because you've talked about genes a lot. So what is your favorite gene?
Oh, that's a funny question. I love that. I think it's changed over the years, but my favorite gene, I think, is a gene that is one that I think it's been a great example of complex trait biology, and something that for our common disease portals has been an example that we give to collaborators. We kind of describe what makes this useful. And this is FTO. It's a gene that's involved in adipocyte biology. And it's associated with BMI, it's associated with diabetes and other phenotypes. And I think it's a great story because, people actually share the floor with me, Alina Klausnischer and others, determined a mechanism for a specific variant within FTO. And it wasn't actually in FTO, you know what I mean? So I guess I think the reason it's a neat gene is because it's a combination of, it's a story about early genome-wide association studies. And it's a really cool example of how the story starts with a locus and there's some genes in the locus, and it brings you down to a single variant that tells you the actual story that's going on there and links it back to this, big data set. So I like that gene as a great example. Other genes. But I think that's my favorite.
That's excellent. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Noël. And actually, I think ending on the gene story is great because, humans love stories. We learn best by stories. And you shared a really great story with us just in general about CFDE and your thoughts and your passion and all of the exciting things to come. So we just really want to thank you for your time. And this was really great.
Thank you. It was good to be here.
You have been listening to Decoding the Data Ecosystem, a CFDE Training Center podcast. Be sure to check out our other episodes in this series. Find out more information about CFDE data and tools that may be valuable to your research by visiting our website.